Rams Gaho Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Gadadhar Shri Gaur Bhakta Vrinda Ki Jai Shri Sri Radha Krishna Gopa Gopita Shama Kundo Radha Kodi Giri Govardhan Ki Jai Shri Vrindavan Dham Ki Jai Navadip Dham Ki Jai Gange Jamuna Tulsi Bhakti Devi Ki Jai Ananda Koti Vaishnava Vrinda Ki Jai Samavekta Bhakta Vrinda Ki Jai Go Premanandi. All glories to Sam of the devotees, all glories to Sam of the devotees, all glories to Sam of the devotees. All glories to Sri Guru and Sri Guranga, all glories to Srila Prabhupada. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Namo Om Vishnupadaya Krishna Prasthaya Bhutale Srimate Bhaktivedanta Swami Nityanamane Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Prachadane Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschatya Deshatadane Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Gadadhar Shri Gaur Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Reading from Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 10, Chapter 72, Verse 8. Rishinam Petra Devanam Suhradam Api Na Prabho Sarvesham Api Bhutanam Ipsita Kratu Radayam. Rishinam, for the sages, Pitra, departed forefathers, Devanam, demigods, Suhradam, for the friends, Api, also, Na, our, Prabho, O Master, Sarvesham, for all, Api, as well, Bhutanam, living beings, Ipsita, desirable, Kratu, of major Vedic sacrifices, Rat, king, Ayam, this. Translation, indeed, my Lord, for the great sages, forefathers, and demigods, for our well-wishing friends, and indeed for all living beings, the performance of this king of Vedic sacrifices is desirable. First, conquer all kings, bring the earth under your control, and collect all the required paraphernalia. Then execute this great sacrifice. These brothers of yours, O king, have taken birth as partial expansions of the demigods ruling various planets. And you are so self-controlled that you have conquered even me, who am unconquerable for those who cannot control their senses. Purport, Srila Prabhupada writes in Krishna, it is said that Bhima was born of the demigod Vayu, and Arjuna was born of the demigod Indra, whereas King Yudhishthira himself was born of the demigod Yamaraj. Srila Prabhupada goes on to say, Lord Krishna told King Yudhishthira that he becomes conquered by the love of one who has conquered his senses. One who has not conquered his senses cannot conquer the Supreme Personality of Godhead. This is the secret of devotional service. To conquer the senses means to engage them constantly in the service of the Lord. The specific qualification of all the Pandava brothers was that they always engaged their senses in the service of the Lord. One who thus engages the senses becomes purified, and with purified senses one can actually render service to the Lord. The Lord can thus be conquered by the devotee through a loving transcendental service. No one in this world, even a demigod, what to speak of earthly king, can defeat my devotee with his strength, beauty, fame, or riches. Purport: here Lord Krishna assures King Yudhishthira that he will have no problem conquering the worldly king, since the king is a pure devotee and the Lord's pure devotees can never be conquered, even by the demigods, what to speak of earthly kings. Although materialists are proud of their power, fame, beauty, and opulence, they can never surpass the pure devotees of the Lord in any of these categories. So Krishna actually is speaking here and giving praise to Yudhishthira and to this sacrifice. So he praises the Pandavas as being great devotees who are partial expansions of the Devatas. This, of course, is a pastime because ultimately these devotees, like the Pandavas, are not part of the material world at all, but they are, in this pastime, they share some of the powers that the Devatas have. Actually, they're beyond the material world. So they're beyond the Devatas, they're superior to the Devatas. And he says this only to indicate that they're very special personalities, and therefore they deserve this position of ruling the world. And they can conquer everyone because, as Yudhishthira himself has stated, if one becomes a devotee of the Lord, then he's got all qualities and all powers, etc. So here, this is stated by Krishna also. Of course, what he talks about here is that they have self-control or sense control, and therefore they're able to conquer the Supreme Lord. Now, sense control is of two types. So the yogis and the gyanis control their senses and ultimately stop the function of the senses in the mind, and then they attain liberation. So, but simply stopping the senses in that way is not a qualification for conquering the Lord. They stop their senses, they get liberation, but they don't conquer the Lord. So that is why in this purport, Prabhupada explains that real conquering the senses mean you engage the senses in serving Krishna. That is the real method of conquering the senses, not just to stop the senses from acting, but to engage them in the proper object. Now, of course, in the process of doing so, the senses become purified, and in fact, one develops spiritual senses. The Jnani and the Yogi try to stop the senses. They don't engage the senses at all. So when they destroy the gross body and the subtle body, they're left with the Atma, but senses are not developed. No spiritual body developed. And they're simply in Brahman, with no perception at all. The devotee, on the other hand, uses his senses in this material world to serve the Lord. These senses become spiritualized so that the engagement is acceptable to the Lord. And in that process of engaging the material senses in the service of the Lord, spiritual senses develop, and spiritual body develops. so that at a certain point that devotee can give up the material body, and then he's only in a spiritual body. So the process of controlling the senses is quite different in bhakti. Controlling the senses means engaging all the different senses in serving the Lord. And through that one develops spiritual senses, which automatically serve the Lord. So in the material world we have material senses, and their nature is to contact material sense objects. This causes bondage in the material world. Because of this bondage, the result of the engaging their senses, the Gyanis and the Yogis try to stop the engagement of the senses completely. So they do that simply by stopping activity, stopping seeing things, or stopping talking, etc. They stop the material engagements. It can be done, but it's difficult. As Krishna says in Bhagavad Gita, Klesha Adhikara. It is difficult to follow this process of completely stopping the senses and then getting liberation. So, the other way of controlling the senses is to get not to get the bad effect of uncontrolled senses, that is ultimately karma, etc., in the material world and bondage, ignorance, etc. We don't have to stop the senses, but we engage the senses in a different object. So we simply engage the senses differently, and we get a different result. So we don't have to stop the engagement of the senses, but we engage it differently. So what is the difference? The difference is we engage the senses not in a material object, but a spiritual object, Supreme Lord. Now, the immediate objection is that the material senses cannot engage in seeing or touching or smelling a spiritual object. They're not qualified. That is so, definitely. However, by following this process of bhakti and engaging the senses in the service of the Lord, directing them to the Lord, gradually one develops those spiritual senses, even by using the material senses. How is that possible? One, of course, is because the object is Krishna, spiritual. So by contact with spiritual object, then spiritualized. But we can always argue, well, the Lord is in contact with the material world, He creates the material world. Why the material world is not spiritual also? He's in everybody's heart. Why they don't become spiritualized? The Lord is present everywhere. He's in all the jivas. Why don't they become pure devotees then? Because He's inside them, in the jiva. So, yes, the object is spiritual, and the senses are material, and definitely any contact with the Supreme Lord is beneficial, and therefore even the jivas in the material world get benefit from Paramatma being within them, even though they don't get become devotees or anything. Still, the Lord assists them in different ways. However, the process of bhakti really works because of devotion. If the person or the jiva has devotion and engages his senses, then we get a completely different effect. So with devotion we engage the senses in the spiritual object, Krishna, and then we get a spiritual result. However, it is not perfect because our bhakti is not perfect also. We have a little bhakti. However, the Lord is very merciful, and therefore even if the bhakti is little and not perfect, still by engaging the senses in serving the Lord, we get a spiritual result. Not completely spiritual, but a little bit of something. So that is how the process of bhakti begins. However, by continually doing it, one becomes more and more devotional, more and more purified. So the process becomes more and more powerful. Until finally we can actually connect with Krishna, and we develop the spiritual senses in order to see Krishna. So this is how the process of bhakti works. It's not simply engagement of the senses in serving the Lord, but with devotion. Then we get this effect of bhakti. Of course, as I said, even without the devotion, we get some effect. So this is like nama bas. You chant the holy name accidentally, you get some effect. Destruction of karmas, etc. can happen. But if we want to actually develop spiritual senses, etc., then we have to follow the process of bhakti properly. And then we get the proper result. So, even then, we do the process of bhakti. If we do the mixed type of bhakti, then we get one result. And we do the pure bhakti, we get a different result. Yes, in either case, we can get to the spiritual world and we can perceive the Lord. But if it's mixed, that means weaker. So the perception is weaker. The relationship is weaker. Service is weaker. Everything is weaker. And if we do the pure bhakti, then everything is stronger. So we get fully developed rasas with Supreme Lord when we do pure bhakti. And when we do this mixed bhakti, then we get at most some shanta rasa. So this is the way in which bhakti works. It has to be done with devotion, and better we do it with pure devotion. Then we get the maximum result from the process. So according to the sadhana, you get the result. You practice impure, you get one result. You practice pure bhakti, get another result. So this is, we can say, logically, or it's reasonable. So that is why the scriptures give us directions on how to perform the bhakti. And also, it gives us directions on which goal we should strive for. So, in this way we get a very clear directions on how to achieve our goal and what the goal is. And then we can, with that knowledge, we can practice nicely and become completely satisfied. So this is the essence of the control of the senses of the devotee. Engage them in the service of the Lord with devotion. Anukulyena Krishnanu. Cultivate the relationship with Krishna favorably while doing the bhakti. Those who do accidental bhakti, it's not favorable, nor is it unfavorable. Those who engage their senses unfavorably, those are the demons. So they get some effect, but it's rather negative, but they get some effect, like Krishna may liberate them or whatever. Those who are neutral, yes, Krishna gives some effect. But when it's favorable, and we're trying to please the Lord, then that's when we get the real effects of bhakti. So the one effect is all the karmas and ignorance are destroyed. The other is good effects. We develop good qualities. We develop spiritual form, develop spiritual senses, and go to the spiritual world. These are the positive effects. So both things happen through the process of bhakti, but in a gradual way. So we go through anartha nivritti, nishcha, ruchi, asakti, bhava, and then prema. And finally we get the perfect result. So controlling the senses, therefore, is not the same as that performed by the gyanis or the yogis. It's quite different. The result is achieved plus more result. The gyanis and yogis, by controlling the senses, want to destroy their karmas and ignorance, etc., subtle body and gross body. That's also achieved by bhakti. But other result is that we develop spiritual senses, spiritual body, and service to the Lord. That's the extra. And of the two things, the devotee is not much interested in destroying the karmas, getting liberation, etc. He's more interested in simply serving the Lord. And to do that, the Lord supplies him with spiritual senses, spiritual body, etc. So the goal, therefore, is different, and the process, therefore, is also different. One is control the senses, and goal is liberation. Other is engage the senses in Krishna, and we attain eternal service to Krishna. So two completely different ways of accomplishing control of the senses with different results. Krishna says in the next verse that no one can defeat the devotee, not only in terms of military strength or whatever, but in terms of beauty, fame, riches, qualities, etc. Of course, ultimately, this is a spiritual thing. Material strength or whatever we don't care about. If one has got spiritual body, spiritual form, etc., then anything in the material world is useless. How can material beauty compare to spiritual beauty or spiritual wealth? It cannot. But as well, for pastimes in the material world, the Lord often illustrates how the devotee is superior to everyone else, and that is the case here of the Pandavas. He doesn't take everything away from them, he gives everything to them, and they can display that their beauty, fame, riches, and wealth. Everyone can see that. Of course, though it looks material, actually it's not. But they're interacting with the material world, and they're visible to people in the material world, so many people will think, oh, this is material fame, material beauty, etc. Ultimately spiritual. But some people will perceive it as material. Even then, the Lord gives advantage to the devotee when he's in the material world. The Lord assists the devotee even when he's in the material body and gives him many benefits. Sadhakas, however, generally try to avoid these things, and that's why Dhruva didn't want to get the kingdom even though it was offered to him by the Supreme Lord. And other persons, they renounce things in order to advance, like Bharat Maharaj. So often the sadhakas will not be interested in attaining anything in the material world in terms of strength, beauty, fame, wealth, etc. They rather consciously reject them as being unfavorable for their bhakti. Other devotees, however, especially those in vacation pastimes, accept these things and use them for the purpose of the Supreme Lord. So that is the case of Yudhishthira. So he accepts the position of being the king. He wants to do the Rajasuya sacrifice, and by that establish his position in order to glorify the Lord. So the devotees who get the strength, beauty, fame, etc., don't use it for themselves. They use it to glorify Supreme Lord. So this is exactly what Yudhishthira is doing here. He wants to establish his position simply for glorifying Krishna and nothing else. So there has no material aspects to whatever the Lord gives him, even though it may look like material rewards or whatever.
Can a devotee experience his spiritual session when he performs sadhana bhakti?
Well, they don't really develop until bhava stage, because that's when he perceives the Lord. So if we had spiritual senses previously, then we would see the Lord before bhava stage. So therefore we don't.
That means you're saying that when one reaches bhava stage, so he can experience that he is a spiritual, like we have a material body, we can experience it.
Yeah.
So in the bhava stage, we can experience that he has a spiritual body.
Yeah. Not fully developed, and that happens in prema, but nevertheless he can see the Lord, etc. So therefore he's developed spiritual senses, which must be attached to a spiritual body, obviously, and he serves the Lord in that body.
My question is that, like, our senses, we see our whole body, material body, but in the bhava stage he has a spiritual, not a fully developed. But can he perceive it that here I have something like it?
Well, he serves the Lord, so if he perceives the Lord, he must have spiritual senses to perceive the Lord with, no? Can't have material senses. And the senses have to be attached to a spiritual body.
And the question is like, although we have a material body, but in the material body there is a Paramatma, which is spiritual. It's not material, not Paramatma.
No.
So, question like that. But again, Krishna is spiritual, but we have a material body. But with the material body, our soul is spiritual, and the soul is trying to experience the Paramatma, which is spiritual. We have a material body, but soul is spiritual, and spiritual soul and Paramatma both is spiritual, but both is spiritual within a material body. And although soul doesn't have a spiritual body, has a material body, but that now with the material body, soul is trying to experience in the presence of the Paramatma. But this is difficult.
How is he doing that? What, a materialist is trying to experience Paramatma? No, generally they don't.
Generally, how can he can perceive that Lord is present in the body because he is a material body.
Yeah, so?
But
materialists never see the Paramatma, even though he's there. They're like the bird eating the fruit of the tree.
Yeah.
They don't see the other bird there who's looking at them all. Huh? So they have no perception of, they don't even have perception that the Atma is there.
But they cannot perceive that.
They think that the body, Atma and Paramatma, both they're ignorant of. Huh? And if they become Gyanis, then they're aware of Atma.
Even devotees don't see it.
Huh?
Seeing is actually a feeling or concept. But we don't see it actually in Paramatma shape or
well, the devotee is not striving to see Paramatma anyway, striving to see Bhagavan. Because Paramatma is simply a witness of all the activities in the material world. He's not the one who responds to the devotion. When Paramatma responds to devotion, then it becomes Bhagavan.
You're saying that bhakti has to be practiced favorably, and if one doesn't practice bhakti favorably, then the result is different. That if one practices bhakti unfavorably means
well, it's not bhakti then. If you have hatred of the Lord, you think of the Lord in hatred, or you call the name of the Lord in hatred, then that's not favorable, that is unfavorable.
You are giving example like a demon.
Yeah.
And the mercy of Brahman. But sometimes we see that there is a past tense between Tulsi Maharani and Shridham, I think. But although Shridham was the eternal associate of Lord Krishna, but he became as a demon, like So how it works?
Well, this is like pastimes again. It's like Jaya and Vijaya became demons, but again, it's pastimes. It's not the real demons. So they're playing a role of being a demon for some time, and then they go back to revert to their other form later on.
He was saying that the opulence of the Pandavas is spiritual, it's not the material. So, but when Duryodhana take over this Indraprastha, but it seems that for him it's like material, it's not a spiritual. When Duryodhana take over the
well, a materialist will think it is material and see it as a material thing, just like you can go to Vrindavan and you can see a material place there also as a materialist, or whatever. But we do know that in the spiritual world, then there are the Pandavas there, and they have their kingdom, and etc. So obviously it's not material there. Huh? And similarly, in the material world, they have their kingdom. Again, it is Dham, just like Krishna and Vrindavan. So Krishna goes to visit the Pandavas. Again, it's a Dham. It's all spiritual. It's not a material place.
So you're saying that although this opulence of Pandavas is spiritual, but according to the person's qualification...
Yeah, you'll see it as material.
But in the context of some of the pure devotees, like as you just mentioned about Dhruva Maharaj, not desiring to accept the kingdom when he realized. So the same, but here we see the Pandavas are Yudhishthira is willing to accept his position so that he sees it differently. The same opportunity is looked at differently by pure devotees. as an opportunity for service or as an obstacle also?
Who? Which devotees?
Like Pandavas were willing to accept the entire kingdom, whereas Dhruva did not want to accept it.
Yeah.
The opportunity is the same. Dhruva looks at it as an obstacle.
Well, finally he accepted it. He also accepted it finally.
So the perception is different even for the pure devotees. I mean, pure devotees are supposed to accept everything in terms of the law.
Yeah, well, it depends. Especially those doing sadhana. And generally they may try to avoid it because it may be dangerous for them. So they may avoid it. So therefore we have very renounced persons like Bharat who gave up the kingdom and then he attained Bhava stage or whatever like that. Others may just do their duty in the material world by the will of the Lord and perform their duties as kings or whatever like that and simultaneously develop.
But again, when you just mentioned about Paramatma, just to understand, Vaishnavas are Paradukadukvi and they don't like any living entity suffering. I mean, they want to take responsibility from them. Paramatma is also shared in the same soul, but does it do the same benefit as the Paradukadukvi or Vaishnavas?
As what?
Vaishnavas are Paradukadukvi, they are very compassionate on every living entity. Paramatma is all the time seated along with the soul, but does it do the same benefit as Paradukadukvi or it does not do?
Same benefit?
Yeah.
Who?
Vaishnavas are Paradukadukvi. Paramatma is seated in everyone's soul, but it does not appear to do the same benefit as the pure devotees of the Lord in terms of compassion.
Well, Paramatma is simply a witness of everything in the material world and all the jivas' desires, and he helps them fulfill those desires in the material world. He is the witness and the permitter.
So it does not benefit like the pure devotees. Pure devotees want to benefit everyone.
Yeah, he's more or less neutral. He's acting neutrally. And then the Supreme Lord and the devotees, when they come as devotees come and then the Supreme Lord as avatar comes, then they distribute mercy at that point.
Again, when you mentioned about the spiritual body, is it necessarily progressive or sometimes it could transform to a living entity because of his devotion?
What's that?
Transformation to a spiritual body, is it generally progressive or is it possible that it could also transform depending on some instant devotion or instant mercy of the pure devotees?
Well, if one gets Kripa Siddhi, then instantaneously they get a body like Putana or someone. That's possible, but it's rare. Well, I suppose we can say, yeah. I suppose he could see the Lord. He must have had he must have had a spiritual body at that point. He went in a self-same body to the Dhruva Loka.
Again, how to understand the connectivity of conquering the entire world before doing this yajna? What is the connection? He was asked to conquer the entire world before getting into the Rajasuya yajna. How to understand the connectivity?
Well, in order to perform the Rajasuya, you first have to get the assent of everybody. There should be no opposition. They should recognize Yudhisthira as the king. He is the final authority. So if there's protest, you're not the king, he can't perform the Rajasuya. So Rajasuya means everybody agrees, and if they don't, then he fights, and then he conquers them, and then they must agree. And then after that, then he performs the Rajasuya.
The Paramatma could also be an Ishtadeva for the devotees of the Lord.
What's that?
One's own Ishtadeva, Ishtadeva.
Well, then it becomes Bhagavan if he's acting with devotion for the... Yeah.
No more Paramatma.
Yeah, he could be the same form, but he's acting as Bhagavan.
In the Bhagavad Gita verse, he said that the Dami Buddhi, that is Krishna, it is not Paramatma.
Yeah, well, when he's acting with devotion, then it becomes Bhagavan. It could be the same form. If it's Vishnu, you worship Vishnu, then Vishnu as Paramatma becomes Vishnu as Bhagavan. He's not just the witness and the permitter anymore.
Jai.